To me, this program is not a journalistic enterprise. It is about learning from people who have reached the top of their fields about their vision, experience, aspirations, and passions. In all my fields of endeavor, be it business, public service, policy research, or the media, I ask myself 3 questions. Am I helping to make a difference? Am I doing the best I can? And am I enjoying myself? Take a seat, make yourself comfortable, and let's go. Today our program deals with a very complex area, and I thought we will start with a question from you. What is Sufism? Could you explain it in a simple way? I know it's a very complex question.
Well, that's a very complex question, as you put it. Sufism is multifaceted, multilateral cultural phenomenon. But if I want to simplify things, I can say that it has a theoretical and a practical side. On the theoretical side, it looks like a metaphysical system, talking about God, talking about the human nature or the human spirit, talking about the world and its different phenomena in a very special language, usually based on a kind of mystical or religious experience. The basic idea here is Wahdat al-Wujud, or let's say pantheism. That is, seeing the world in its different phenomena as being somehow united with the ultimate reality, that is the God. Well, that is a very, very simple explanation of the theoretical side, but on the practical side, we can say that Sufism is a kind of ascetic form of life, but an ascetic form of life mixed with passion.
How did Sufism evolve? I mean, in a historical context?
It sure has a historical context. It has started from a kind of, let's say, as I said before, a kind of ascetic life, but it turned out to be a little bit different throughout different centuries. For example, you can see that many Sufis have a special ritual called sama, in which they dance and they swirl. And maybe you have seen these swirling dervishes, you know.
That's right, yes.
That was not something that you would have found in early Sufism, but in the later stages of its development, it became a ritual, it became a common practice. So like any other cultural phenomena, it actually developed and it had its own history. So we can say that it began as an ascetic form of life, but it developed into a very complex set of rituals, one of which, for example, is sama, the dance, which is very, anyone who looks at Sufism from outside sees this sama ritual as being representative of Sufism. Of course, Sufism has many other practical aspects, but this one perhaps stands out somehow.
What I find fascinating about Sufism in many ways, in Sri Lanka, for example, Sufism is considered to be part of our own cultural fabric as well, especially among the Muslims. On the other side, internationally, Sufism is the West. There is an appeal as well. I know I read a lot of Rumi, always in translation. I have never had the privilege of understanding the full context of Rumi because I think in translation something gets lost. I think Coleman Barks' translations are what I've been reading. But how does Sufism work that way? In one side, it's able to have this cultural context within Islam, and on the other side, even in the West, people are able to, non-Muslims are also able to appreciate Sufism. How does that happen?
Well, I think that in the Western world, we have, let's say, different interpretive communities as well. So people look at Sufism from different perspectives or from different angles. Western scholars, for example, tend to look at the mystical union and the idea of mystical experience that we can find in Sufi texts. That is, Sufis tend to base their knowledge of God on some sort of direct experience. That experience is called, well, sometimes religious experience, sometimes mystical experience. The terms are actually interchangeable. Now, what is the most interesting aspect of this phenomenon is that you can find its counterparts in other religious and mystical traditions, in Christian mysticism, in, let's say, in Buddhism even, the idea of nirvana and the experience of this nirvana state, and the idea of mystical union with God in Christianity. So these are, let's say, some common aspects.
So is Sufism potentially a sort of a bridge? Because now as a Buddhist, I appreciate Rumi and Hafez's poetry. It appears that even Christians appreciate it. Is it a bridge?
It can be a bridge because, well, let's say that you talk about this mystical union. You can find its counterparts. For example, Sufis have this idea of fana, which literally means annihilation, or let's say annihilation in God. That is another term for describing this mystical state, which is called, well, fana, or sometimes they call it fana fillah, that is annihilation in God. And this very idea has some similarities with the idea of nirvana. I'm not going to say that they are the same, but well, there are similarities. And the same thing applies to the idea of union with God in Christianity. They all can be compared. And let's not forget that we have a human nature. And this human nature has, let's say, different aspects throughout the history. And one aspect, perhaps, is the idea of this religious or mystical union, which we can find in Sufism, in Buddhism, and in Christianity, and in many other religious traditions.
I believe you did your doctorate on Rumi, one of the greatest poets, Sufi poets, and also poets, period. Could you, because the audience probably would not know much about poets like Rumi and Hafez, could you explain a little bit about them, their context, starting with Hafez and then maybe Rumi?
Okay, well, Hafez is a great Persian poet of medieval times, and the reasons we have for paying too much attention to Hafez are many. Let me just sketch a brief set of those reasons. First of all is the aesthetic pleasure you get from reading Hafez's poems. They are the best example of using language in a sublime way. If you know Persian, and if you are familiar with the Persian tradition of ghazal, that is a special genre of love poem in Persian, then you will find the ghazals or the poems of Hafez very interesting. And when you read those poems, you can see a poetic world which resembles no other poetic world. It's a very different poetic world. The similes, the metaphors, different language games that you find in Hafez, assonance, rhythm, rhyme, and anything related to the poetry will be found there in its sublime form. That is one aspect of Hafez's poems. And, well, we can say that we are homo aestheticus. Hafez is a thinker, is a great thinker, not a systematic philosopher, but a great thinker. Today, we are actually accustomed to reading the aphorisms of Nietzsche, of Sartre, of Wittgenstein. The language they use and the intellectual insights they offer quenches our, let's say, emotional and intellectual thirst. Hafez can do the same thing. I mean, many of
So if you were to compare Hafez with a Western figure, whom would it be? Nietzsche, or, I mean, you just mentioned
well,
Nietzsche.
it might be a little bit hard because it needs some contextualization, and sometimes these comparisons are out of context. But, well, you can say that Hafez's aphorisms on human nature, on love, on death, and mortality will somehow resemble not just Nietzsche, but some of Nietzsche's aphorisms. And Nietzsche himself mentions Hafez in a special context in one of his books on the genealogy of morality. He mentions Hafez alongside Goethe. And it says that these two guys have understood that the human nature has two sides, the sensual side, and let's call it the spiritual side, or the non-sensual side. And these contradictory aspects of human nature are fully appreciated by Hafez and Goethe. And Nietzsche mentions these two figures. So we can say that this aspect is an aspect that Nietzsche would have loved.
I was curious about another aspect because I noticed that you very often compare Hafez to German philosophers. Any particular reason for that?
Well, you can say that the reason for that comparison sometimes comes from Hafez being mentioned by great German poets and philosophers like Goethe and like Nietzsche.
More so than others, is it?
Yeah, that's the point. I mean, and then you go and you read Nietzsche, you go and you read Goethe, and you find some intercultural similarities as well. Of course, those intercultural similarities need to be contextualized so that you cannot simply say what Nietzsche says is equivalent to what Hafez says in a very simple form. It would be too reductive to do that and would not be academically acceptable, I think.
Now, Rumi is, in a way, to some extent, better known and appreciated internationally. Why is that?
Well, it might have its own reasons. One might be that there are more translations of Rumi available nowadays. And the reasons might not be because Rumi is easier to understand, because Rumi is not very easy to understand. Let me tell you, for example, that if you read the Masnavi of Rumi, you need a lot of background knowledge to understand it. I mean, you have to know about the ancient philosophy. You have to know about the ancient tradition of theology. You need to have some knowledge about even ancient astrology and about the folk beliefs, many other things, many other aspects. And no single translation can simply reflect them. So you need contextualizations. But maybe some popular translations of Rumi will somehow simplify the whole context for the Western reader. And the Western reader enjoys the poetic language of Rumi, the metaphors, well, the similes, and the ambiguities. And the Western reader will use his or her own creativity to interpret Rumi in his or her own terms. That would be, well, a great cultural phenomenon, but it has its own shortcomings, I think.
So if you were to sort of say what is, in a very sort of the essence of the difference between Hafez and Rumi, what would it be?
Well, you can say that Rumi is a great Sufi master, a great Sufi poet, and a great Sufi thinker. And his teachings can be contextualized within the parameters of Sufism and the Sufi doctrines. Hafez, however, is a little bit different. Hafez uses the Sufi metaphors, the Sufi similes, and let's say the Sufi poetic heritage. But he's not a Sufi in my idea. In my view, Hafez is not a Sufi. He uses the Sufi language, but he creates a different poetic world. And the difference comes when you look at some themes in Hafez's poems which are not Sufi themes or Sufi doctrines. For example, Hafez thinks that our very own existence is like a riddle which cannot be unraveled, and nobody can unravel it. It's a mystery. Well, this is not an idea that you will find in Sufism, because in Sufism, our human nature is already known. Our human nature is something bestowed upon us by God. We have descended from God, and now we are going to ascend. And this ascending is actually the path of Sufi.
So if one were to use, let's say, I'm using probably a modern word, a platform for intercultural or interfaith dialogue, would Hafez be the better platform for it, or would Rumi be the better platform?
I would say both of them. I would say that the Iranian culture has offered many good insights into the human nature. And I would like to put Hafez and Rumi alongside many other literary writers and poets who have gained this universal status, and their works have been considered classics. Well, we read the Iliad and the Odyssey of Homer. We read the Divine Comedy of Dante. We read Shakespeare's works, Goethe's works, Dostoevsky's works, the brothers Karamazov, for example, and we come to have an understanding of human nature. Now, Persian literature, at its best, that is, in a way it is reflected in the works of Rumi or Hafez, does the same thing. We learn something about this human nature. That's the same thing that we learn from other classics, from other literary classics of the world. That's the same thing. Of course, maybe different aspects of human nature will be found there, but they are still part of this basic human core. So I would say that the Persian literature has offered a window to the human nature. This is one way to look at it, of course. And in terms of intercultural dialogue, I can say we can both read Hafez and use Hafez. We can read and use Rumi as well. And they showed it, I think, in another aspect, they showed that the very idea of, for example, fundamentalism, religious fundamentalism, or religious extremism cannot be part of the culture, our ancient or our, let's say, our ancient culture. Because in Hafez and in Rumi, you find no sign of extremism.
This is very interesting because, as I mentioned at the outset also, Sri Lankan Muslims in Sri Lanka are heavily influenced by Sufism. Not only in Sri Lanka, I think in the South Asian subcontinent. And what you mentioned, that with Sufism and extremism, they really don't go together. This is something I also personally believe. Could you maybe elaborate a bit more on that from a philosophical point of view as well?
Well, before saying or talking about this issue, saying anything about this issue, I have to say something, Well, Sufism, like any other cultural phenomenon, has its own dark sides and its bright sides. And Rumi as a Sufi might not be an exception. But on the bright side, and that's the important thing, Rumi and many other Sufis teach a sort of tolerance that can be very inspiring for different religious sects. The basic idea that Sufis allude to in this context is that God and the nature of God should and can be known on the basis of some sort of personal experience. That is a very important thing. And apart from all doctrinal ideas concerning the nature of God, apart from all different doctrinal ideas concerning the way God interacts with the world or with human beings, there is a very important aspect that you have to discover yourself. The way of that discovery is the personal experience. This gives Sufism a very special place in our culture and in the Islamic culture. This gives the Sufi a path to God which is somehow personal, which is somehow based on personal experience, not on the way a special authority tells you to understand God. It is a special path that you have to go by yourself. Of course, you need sometimes the guidance of a spiritual leader or something. That is called murshid in Sufi terminology. But most of the times, it is a path that you should take by yourself. And there is a Sufi by the name of Omid Hamedani, a Sufi of medieval times. He asks the Sufis to look at all religious doctrines as simply way stations, not as an end in themselves, and to transcend them so that they can reach the ultimate reality by transcending all religious and doctrinal ideas concerning God. It's a very important, I think, aspect of Sufism that needs to be emphasized.
How is it that, what I mentioned earlier, the spread of Sufism in our region, how do you think that would have happened? I mean, what would be how did it take place, you think?
Well, you mean in Asia?
Yes, in Asia.
Well, I think that the interesting thing is that Sufism offers something in the context of, let's say, religious doctrines, which is very inspiring for people. I mean, this way that it looks at the world, and it looks at the relation between man and God, and the status of man in this relation. Sufism asks you to go through a certain path by yourself and to discover God on the basis of your own experience. That would be very appealing to the human nature. It gives you a sense of difference, gives you a sense of discovering something new. It might be one reason why Sufism became so widespread, because it appealed to an aspect of human nature.
When you look at the future of Sufism, how do you see it?
Well,
in the modern context with technology and what is happening in the world today, how do you see Sufism and the modern world blending in?
I'm not sure that we can somehow make them unanimous with each other or create a kind of harmony between these two. I'm not sure about that. But I think that putting aside the doctrinal and metaphysical and theological aspects of Sufism apart, the important thing that Sufism can offer in this modern world is that if you believe in God or if you believe in an ultimate reality, you can experience that without basing that on a kind of religious authority or something. You can go through it by yourself. This has some links with modern individualism because, modern culture is an individualistic culture, and this individual aspect that every human being is emphasized in this modern culture. So Sufism has something like this to offer, but it needs some sort of reconstruction, you know. It needs some sort of reconstruction. You have to put aside many historical layers, many theological, theosophical layers, and sometimes even you have to decontextualize Sufism to extract this idea. But it is there. It is there. It is not something that you are going to create. It is still there, and it can be reconstructed. And some thinkers have made some suggestions in that way.
Because I have always been fascinated with how, let's say, a poet like Hafez can be used as a bridge, intercultural, interfaith bridge. if you were to structure it, let's say in the Sri Lankan context, we have many religions here and the relevance of Hafez to this whole dialogue, how would you structure it? What would be a good framework to approach this on?
Well, we can start from the idea of, for example, tolerance in Hafez. The idea of tolerance in Hafez is something that can be used in that way. There's a famous couplet in Hafez's Diwan, which reads, and I quote it in Persian, جنگ 72 ملت همه را عذر بنه چون ندیدند حقیقت ره افسانه زدند. Well, if I want to translate it, I would say transcend all the religious and doctrinal wars because not seeing the ultimate truth or reality, all the religious sects have gone astray. Well, that was somehow a literal translation of Hafez's couplet, but I would say it offers a kind of understanding that we can have, or we should have, about tolerance. If we are not sure that we have understood the ultimate nature of reality, or the ultimate nature of God, or whatever ultimate being we believe in, then we should be tolerant of others' ideas about the same thing, about the ultimate reality. I'm not sure that you have reached the essence of the ultimate reality, and you are not sure that I have reached the essence of the ultimate reality. We can have a dialogue, we can talk about this, we can negotiate our different understandings that we have, but no need to say that my understanding of the ultimate reality, is the best version that you can have. And now Hafez has a kind of a skepticism concerning all religious and doctrinal wars. And he tells us to transcend them because the passive truth is different from that. And, well, I think that would be a great starting point.
It's also the perfect point to finish this discussion. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, too, for inviting me to this, let's call it, intercultural dialogue.